Hello! Today I wanted to share with y'all a little adventure I had in attempting to paint on wood slices. This is a project I've been wanting to do for months and months, and I've had everything I needed to do it, but every time I had the time to do it, I would think about all the steps I had to do before I could even start painting, and I'd just be like, nah, some other time. So this week I finally convinced myself to break down the process over a couple of days so that I wouldn't get overwhelmed, and it took me like 10 minutes of prep work and I was so mad. So mad that I had put this off all this time and it ended up only taking 10 minutes to get the wood slices ready. But before I go any further than that, I should probably tell you all what I decided to paint on them in case you're just sitting there like, what even is this? So I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV lately, and if you don't know, it is an MMORPG in the Final Fantasy series, and I'm like maybe 0.25% into the game, and I'm already feeling inspired to do fan art, so that's exactly what I did. So for the first wood slice, I did a chocobo and its chick, which are basically gigantic chickens you can ride around the game. The second slice will be a Moogle, which is a race that appears in most of the Final Fantasy games and is kind of like a series mascot. In 14, they just seem to function like mailmen, and I have yet to see if they have any other purpose, but yeah. And the third slice will be the ultimate cutie, Carbuncle, who is a summon featured in a lot of the games as well. I picked the Arcanist class just so I could be blessed with Carbuncle's presence because he was a favorite of mine way back in Final Fantasy VIII. Also, I want to apologize for this first piece being slightly out of focus. It looked focused on my phone, but here on my computer it is a little blurry, which is super sad and I hate it, but the other two are in focus at least. Okay, so I've had these wood slices laying around forever. The oval one I painted Carbuncle on. I don't even remember where I got, but the other two I'm pretty sure I got at Michael's. Wherever I got it from, the oval slice was definitely much cheaper quality than the Michael's ones because when I drilled a hole into it, the back of it did splinter. Luckily, it wasn't enough to make me think it was going to fall apart, but yeah, that was a thing. And if you can hear my dogs licking themselves in the back, I am so sorry, it sounds so gross. But having to drill holes into all the wood slices was one of the things that I needed to do as prep work because I knew I wanted to put twine through these to hang them up eventually. With what I do for my full-time job, I'm not shy around drills, but just the thought of having to find the drill bit and make sure the drill was charged and all that just seemed like this unreasonably huge mountain I just couldn't make myself climb. And looking back, it was really silly, but at the time it just seemed like too many steps. I know some places sell the wood slices that already have holes and twine through them, but they are more expensive, like too expensive or something that takes about 2 seconds to do yourself if you have a drill already. But yeah, I finally bit the bullet and put the holes in all my wood slices. And the second thing I did as prep was to put gesso down. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but yeah. I don't know much about gesso except that it acts as a base for paint, especially when you're painting on unconventional surfaces. I've seen some people put gesso on wood and other people not use it, so this was mainly an experiment because I was curious to see if there would be a noticeable difference. So I put gesso on 2 of the wood slices and left this chocobo one without gesso just to see. And lastly, before I could paint, I needed to sketch. I did not film that part because I'm still a little self-conscious about sketching on camera, and I find I can sketch faster if I don't film it. Eventually we'll get to where I can consistently sketch on camera, but for this, nah. I found that my color erase pencils worked pretty well on the 2 pieces I put gesso on, but they absolutely would not show up well at all on this non-gesso piece, so I ended up having to use a graphite pencil, which, as you will see later, was a blessing in disguise. This piece with the chocobos was the most detailed piece, but I decided to tackle it first since it was the one without gesso, and I wanted to use it as a control to see what it was like to paint on naked wood before I started on the other pieces. That being said, my experience with acrylic paint is extremely minimal, so it was kind of a big dumb moment to do the hardest piece first, but this is also my favorite of the 3, so it turned out okay, I guess. And the paint I'm using is the My Artscape brand of acrylic paint that I bought off Amazon about 4 years ago and hardly touched. I didn't have the majority of the tubes even opened when I sat down to paint these wood slices, so that should tell you all you need to know about how often I use acrylic paint. I think the only thing that helped me make these mini paintings even remotely successful is that I was able to apply some of my digital painting knowledge to traditional media, though it would have been super nice to have that Control-Z for these, honestly. I was a little nervous about using acrylics because I know that they dry really fast, which is one of the things that I like about watercolor, is that it doesn't dry really fast and it can be reactivated after it has dried. Not so with acrylics. Throughout all these pieces, I kept squeezing out and mixing way more paint than I needed, and it hurt my heart so much. It was such a waste. I guess the more I use them, I'll get a feel for how much I need in the future. So even though these are far from being watercolor, I did find myself using water with these paints quite a bit, especially for the base layers and the lines. Just slightly dipping my brushes in water before I picked up the paint helped make the paint more transparent, and it was also easier to work with. It was a lot easier to layer the paint and build up these layers gradually, and the line work came out much softer when I used water as opposed to the darker lines you see where I didn't use as much water. As we're getting into the second piece here, you can see what I mentioned before about the graphite being a blessing. I found out very quickly that the acrylic paint smears coal erase and pretty much obliterated my lines. It wasn't as much of an issue in this piece, but in the last one, it almost ruined the whole thing. For this piece, I didn't really mind the smearing effect because the pink tint matched the color scheme of the Moogle anyways. For these next two pieces, I wanted the characters to be the main focus, so I didn't do much of a background on either of them. It was nice not to have to worry about extra details in these, especially since I was having to do damage control on the coal erase issue. As I was working on these, I also started to see how the fast drying quality of acrylics can be useful. Whenever I made a mistake, like going outside the lines or accidentally painting over something, it was super easy to just go in and fix those hiccups with another color. It's not like gouache where you can't layer on paint without disturbing what's beneath. And that's my main gripe with gouache and is why I don't use it often. Watercolor isn't as bad in that aspect, but with acrylics, once the paint is dry, it is not going to mix with the layers you put over it. So that kind of makes up for the fact that you can't really lift it to correct mistakes like you can with watercolor, because it's so easy to just apply more paint to hide things without having to wait an entire millennium for it to dry. As far as brushes went, I actually didn't know what I had when it came to brushes that were meant for acrylic when I sat down to do these pieces. Most of my brushes are watercolor brushes, and I only had a handful of brushes that I felt would work for acrylics, and 3 of those were almost exactly the same size. The blue brushes are really old ones that I've had for a really long time. They're just your average value pack brushes, nothing special, but they work. The other brushes I use for these pieces are ones I got from an art box a while back. I've been meaning to do a video on the art box since March, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet because, again, a lot of steps. But it was the box that Sibylline Monet, probably saying that wrong, did in collaboration with Mossery. These brushes were meant to be used with gouache, but since my acrylic brush options were so limited, I ended up pulling those out for this as well. If it wasn't for the smallest brush in particular, these pieces would have given me a really hard time. The tiny brush was a lifesaver when it came to the lines because it was such a fine tip. It was also really supple, unlike the value pack brushes, which were stiff. They served their purpose, but if I had tried to line with them, they would have made the lines too chunky and goopy for my liking. I was able to make do with what I had, but I feel like I definitely want to look more into acrylic brushes and get a better collection of those going just to experiment with. I'm also going to need to get more if I want to do bigger pieces because all of the acrylic brushes I have are pretty small, and that's a problem for large pieces. And now we're getting into the last piece, which also turned out to be the most difficult. This one was pretty instant panic as I started to lay down the base layer because, again, the coal erase just disappears underneath the paint. For this one, the effect was even worse than the Moogle piece, and I just instantly started to panic when I saw the lines just completely disappear. You can still kind of see them on camera, but in person I could not see the lines at all, and I 100% would not have been able to work like that. So I ended up taking a paper towel and trying to lift up what paint I could before it had a chance to dry, just to salvage as much of the line work as possible. I was just barely successful enough to be able to continue with this piece, but y'all, this piece almost didn't happen. Because of this major hiccup right out of the starting gate, I was pretty spooked for the remainder of this piece, and I think that does show in the final product, though I still do like the end result. I was super cautious about this the rest of the time, and I ended up using far more water in this one than I did in the others. I wanted to make sure I kept the layers of paint as translucent as I could and just build things up really slowly so that I wouldn't lose any of the shapes and lines I needed as a guide. Even with taking it slow, I felt like I kept having to go back and redefine shapes over and over in this piece. I don't know, I guess because Carbuncle's color scheme doesn't have much variation, it was just really easy for things to get lost. I had to mix a bunch of blues and just keep layering them on until I reached the level of definition I wanted while still maintaining Carbuncle's soft, round look. All that aside, I love how the lines turned out in this piece in particular. I got a better feel for the correct water to paint ratio for the lines from the Moogle piece, so for this last one I was able to get the lines to look the smoothest out of the three. I'm usually really nervous about doing lines in paint, so this was a big test for me to see if I even could do it and make it look nice, and I'm pretty pleased with the result. Definitely a confidence builder, and I think I'm going to be way more comfortable now attempting lines with watercolor or gouache should the opportunity arise. So all in all, I think this little venture into wood slice painting was a successful one. I had a lot of fun doing these paintings in spite of the various hiccups along the way, and I definitely learned a lot from these. As far as the gesso situation went, the only difference it made that I could tell was when it came to the lines. If I want to use coal erase for my sketches, I'll need to put gesso down just for it to show up, but given the smearing issue, I think graphite is going to be my go-to for future wood slice art. I think coal erase's tendency to get eaten by other media can be used as an advantage in some applications, but for me, for this application, I just wasn't a fan. So yeah, I don't feel like gesso will be a necessary part of my workflow when it comes to future pieces like this. When it comes to the paints, they are super vibrant, and even though the tubes are pretty small, I had a lot of paints to choose from. This set was about $35 for 48 tubes, and once I get the hang of how much I need and can learn to not be as wasteful, I do think this set gives a great bang for your buck if you're a beginner. And with that, we'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was somewhat informative and fun to watch. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and that's really helpful with YouTube's algorithm, and it would be much appreciated. So yeah, I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye guys!